Are you ready?
Absolutely.
So, firstly, give us name, surname, and a couple of words about yourself.
I'm Francis Russell. I'm a deputy chairman of Christie's, the art auctioneer. I also write about Italian works of art and so on. So I'm an art historian, I suppose, but I've always had rather too many interests.
In what you have diploma?
I read history at Oxford.
So first question, what you have heard about the Colonel Claude Bayfield's talks? Where from have you heard about him, and what in total know about him?
That's a very long question, or rather the answer is quite a long one. Early in the war, my mother was 18 and left school, and she was going into MI6, and she spent a very few weeks learning how to type, and learning how to type at the same time was a girl called Tamara Stokes, who became a great friend of hers and was going into the BBC. And because of their friendship, my mother came just as Tamara spent a lot of time with my mother's family. My mother spent a lot of time with Tamara's family, particularly when she was in London, which she was for part of the war. And she came, obviously, to know Tamara's mother very well, but also Tamara's much older father. I think he was probably 20 years older than his wife. He was already very frail, but my mother, who is, as I think I told you, her memory isn't as good as it was, but he was clearly incredibly charming. And when I sort of mentioned him to her, she sort of smiled with pleasure at remembering a generous and interesting man. Because we didn't have a house in London, very often when I was in London as a boy, I used to stay with Olga and Tamara in their flat in Westminster. And obviously a lot of her father, Tamara's father's things were there, including, as I've said, two of the Persian rugs in the room where we sit now, and his Persian library, or Caucasian library, I should say, because there were no doubt things about Georgia too. Unfortunately, I never really studied those. I was at school at Westminster, which was 3 minutes walk away from Tufton Court. So from when I was 13 to when I left, when I was 16, I used to see them very regularly. And in addition, Tamara probably came to stay every 2 or 3 months, and her mother very often came with us. So one knew a lot about the past, a lot about the Russia they'd known, a lot about displaced Russians in the south of France, where Colonel Stokes and Mrs. Stokes, Olga, as I mentioned, spent a lot of time in the 20s and 30s, because there was a huge Russian community there, including, of course, many friends of theirs who'd fallen on even harder times than they had. And I also knew Olga's younger sister, Masya, who married Guy Repton, who had a celebrated estate in Kenya, which after his death she continued to run. And she and Olga were extremely close, and she was a great supporter. Olga, who was frail and lived till, I suppose, she was in her mid-80s and was emotionally and financially very dependent on her daughter. Tamara clearly adored her father. She probably knew more about what he'd done than she let on. Though if I'd been intelligent enough at that age to ask her the sort of questions you're asking me now, I would have learnt a great deal more. But when there was a room in which there were a certain number of, it was a large flat, a room in which there were a trunk which I always knew housed her father's papers. And when she was coming to stay with us for Christmas and discovered that she had very advanced lung cancer, almost the first thing she did was ring me up and say, could I arrange for her father's papers to be put somewhere, because it was very important for the record of what he'd done to be preserved. And she was hugely relieved when I was able to tell her, literally the afternoon, same afternoon as she asked me, that the War Museum would collect the papers the next day. And so she'd be thrilled that you, as representatives of a free Georgia, are taking an interest in what he tried to do. And I should add that my sister, who is not here now, my sister Virginia, who was a goddaughter of Tamara's, immediate comment when I said that you'd been in touch was to say how completely thrilled Tamara would be, and anything we could do to help, she would wish us to do.
Thank you very much. Okay.
I think what you have to remember is, you see, there were no Stokes relations at all. So she had no blood relations on her father's side. And apart from her mother's sister, who had no children, she had no relations from her father's side, from her mother's side of the family. So my mother became an incredibly close friend of hers, and the very fact that she asked that her ashes could be put in our garden at home tells you that my mother meant a great deal, my mother and indeed the rest of the family meant a great deal to her emotionally. There were a few other families with whose children she was quite thick, but because they lived in London, she didn't go to stay with them, and they didn't need to stay with her. So perhaps they heard less. And at the end, when she had cancer and she was dying, it was my sister who slept in her bedroom, hospital bedroom, with her for the last 3 weeks. So she had an immense sort of attachment to my family, which extended, to my mother's parents. And I should say that just as my mother simply adored her father, who was a celebrated mountaineer, you have the record on Mount Everest in 1922 and so forth, Tamara also thought of her father as having been a heroic figure. And the fact that he was dead and beyond recall by the time I knew her did not dim that deep admiration. You see, Tamara must have been born in 1923, at which stage, I've forgotten the year Colonel Stokes was born, but it was in the 1860s, wasn't it? 1875. Well, still, he was 48 in that case, which is quite old to be a father for the first time, particularly then. Before I was born. Whereas his widow, I did know. I mean, I was deeply fond of his widow. She was incredibly kind to me, and it was because she was so fond of me, but I became very thick with her sister too, latterly. And I have to say, my mother was a wonderful friend, both to Tamara and to her father. The other thing I should say about Tamara was, like quite a lot of people who are only children, she talked continually. So if there was an audience, she didn't believe in silence. I mean, her life was, she went to work for the BBC during the war. She remained at the BBC working on the World Service, covering French-speaking North Africa, because of their having lived in France between the wars. She spoke marvelous French. I mean, she had been schooled in French, and she spoke French as naturally as she spoke English, but she also spoke Russian, which is what her mother spoke to her. Whether the colonel spoke Russian, I don't know.
And from the stories which you heard about the colonel from Olga, from Tamara, or from your mother, what was the impression you had about him?
Well, he clearly was anybody who gets the DSO, the Distinguished Service Order, it's a it's a signal honour for. It's one of the greatest military honours you can have in this country. One now realises, partly because of what you've told me, that he was obviously, I always knew that he'd retired not long after the First War. I'm sure he was terribly distressed by his inability to get more help for your country at a time, as you know, when we were in a terrible mess in Turkey and elsewhere, and English foreign policy was overreaching itself. But I think the very fact that he was prepared to spend a lot of time in France, because of the strength of the Russian community there, tells you that he felt slightly detached in some respects from his own country. I mean, one had the impression that Constantinople at that point was a melting pot, because there were a huge number of Russians who obviously had fled with very little. And also the whole English and French position in Constantinople was very precarious, because though we controlled Constantinople at the end of the 1914-18 war, of course, as you'll remember, Lloyd George had very responsibly encouraged Venizelos, the Greek prime minister, to hugely overreach his country in Turkey. We imagined that Constantinople would remain a European city, in a sense. And it was a terrible miscalculation. So at the time, these Russians were, as it were, fleeing and trying to find a new life. I'm quite certain that somebody as perceptive as Colonel Stokes will have realised the future in Istanbul, as it was to become, was surprisingly complicated. And it was natural for Olga's parents to concentrate in the south of France, part because there were so many Russian people. I remember Olga saying that you could, if you were, Nice was the town to which so many of them went, and her saying you could tell if somebody was a Russian aristocrat in Nice if you looked at their shoes, because a Russian aristocrat would only think of polishing the front of them and forget to polish the back. And so if you saw somebody with a scruffy heel and a well-polished front of the shoe, you could instantly tell that there were Russian aristocrats who'd had servants to look after them in the past and no longer could afford to employ them. I mean, there were lots of people in a difficult position, and I'm sure from the way Olga talked about it that Colonel Stokes, again, did a huge amount, not just for his wife and his parents-in-law and for Marcia, but others. Indeed, now we're talking about it. I remember this is going back to 1962 when I was 13, going on a sightseeing expedition for a day with Olga. Tamara drove us in her small car, and a very, very old Countess Tolstoy, who again said, how wonderful Colonel Stokes had been to her when her world suddenly imploded. One can readily understand him, probably to begin with, taking pity on a family and then falling in love with Olga, who's the most enchanting, gentle woman. I don't think she had a mean thought or a selfish thought in her body. She cooked beautifully too. He won't have starved.
So is this meeting, they met in 1920s?
They met, Tamara left school when my mother did, so she was presumably born in 1923. And I've forgotten what her birthday is. My sister would remember, but I'm sorry, I don't. They would have been married the previous year, 1922. At least they wouldn't have been married after 1922. So the marriage obviously took place not long after he left your country.
Past life.
Well, the very fact that their daughter was called Tamara is very eloquent. And of course, I hadn't realized the significance of the name. I knew from Tamara that her father had spent a lot of time in Persia, and there were certainly quite a lot of books about Persia, as we English called it in that generation. Including the one I've shown you here, which is the only book of his which I have retained. And he was clearly in Persia in the run-up to the war, to the Great War, to the 1418 war. And I assume when you went through the papers, you will have found material about his time in Persia before he came to Georgia. But the fact that he'd spent so much time in Persia shows you how fascinated he was by that part of the world. I don't know if he was involved with, for example, at a later stage with the Royal Geographical Society, which I don't need to tell you how many English people have been fascinated by your part of the world, and not least because of mountaineers. And again, For 4 generations, my family were mountaineers, and so the Caucasus have always had a particular appeal. And Tamara was certainly well aware of the drama of the mountains in the Caucasus, but she never, I have to say, she never talked to me about Georgian, her father's Georgian experience. And I can imagine that the whole thing might have been too bitter for him, because he will have, just as my own father, until very late in his life, never talked about having been a Japanese prisoner of war. It's a rather English thing to find it difficult to talk about certain subjects which are of enormous emotional importance to you. And particularly somewhere, he will have obviously, and I sense that from what you told me in your first message, he will obviously have been intensely disappointed that the Foreign Office and so on were unable, for whatever reason, to give the support he thought your country needed. And for that reason, I can imagine he might have been very reticent in talking about it subsequently. But Tamara often talked about Persia. The rugs were always referred to as Persian, and I should think there were 20 or 30 of them, which he'd obviously collected when he was in Persia. Yes, I'm sure it was just too bitter for him to chatter about. That I've spent. Okay. It happens that I've spent a lot of time in the Near East. It's my form of escape from old master pictures, which I work on. And I have written little books about Syria, Jordan, and Turkey. And I must have been to Turkey 20 times. And of course, one of the most thrilling groups of buildings in what is now Turkey, of the great Armenian churches, but also the incredible Georgian churches. And actually, though they're less familiar to an English audience, the Georgian churches are by far the most distinguished. We're very ignorant of them, and it wasn't until reading what is by far the best book in English about the Georgian monuments of Eastern Turkey by somebody called Sinq that I realized that Queen Tamara was a great Georgian hero. Tamara, of course, was dead by then, but I suddenly realized why she'd been given that name. I'd assumed that Tamara was a Russian name. But it was clearly Claude Stokes expressing his devotion to your country. I can't tell you. I know he was ill for a long time. I know he was very frail and very weak. I don't know why he died, but I know he had not been a well man for many years, and that Olga spent a lot of time nursing him. But I'm not sure what his illness was.
What was his occupation after retirement? What was his life, if you have heard?
Well, I suspect not very much, because I think it was a question of living quite quietly. You see, by the time my mother knew him, he was already, I suspect, more or less confined to the house. I don't think he was very active by that stage. I'm not aware that he had a job. I mean, the strange thing is, of course, that suddenly something will turn up. Now you've ignited the trail of being interested in him. We may come across it may provoke other people to think about him. And I'm already, trying to think which of the people in Tamara's life, many of whom are dead, and of course a lot of her friends were Kenyan friends of her aunt, and therefore not particularly relevant to Claude Stokes. But I hope one will be able to find out other elements of the story. But I think you have to assume that he, as it were, did leave a retired, quiet domestic life with his family, his wider family. I don't know when his father-in-law and mother-in-law died, but I believe he did take on responsibility for them because, of course, they had, again, no money, and it was he who supported them. She never said anything of the kind, but she wouldn't have said it. She was very, very determined that his papers, which she felt would preserve his reputation for a future generation, should be available. She may well never have read the papers herself. I think it's quite probable that she never did, because she never mentioned to me that she had. They were preserved as a kind of document which would secure his long-term reputation. She will have been well aware that in any wars, in any diplomatic activities, there are certain people who get given more credit than they should be given because newspapers catch hold of them or whatever, and there are certain people who get less credit than they should be given. And he clearly was one of those. Perhaps if outside resources had been able to save Georgia from the communists, his reputation would have been preserved more publicly in this country. He obviously must have considered it a tragic failure that he had been able to get the support. He clearly, from what you tell me of his letters to the Foreign Office, considered that Georgia was due. I did not look at his papers before they went to the War Museum, and I haven't looked at them since. My role was to make sure they got there intact and that they were preserved, and with that what his daughter felt that he'd achieved and which needed to be preserved for future reference should be in the right hands. And I have to say the archive of the Imperial War Museum is an extraordinary resource. And I also have to tell you that when I rang to say would they take them, I didn't know about his Caucasian position, nor I think did they. I told them that I understood that he'd been seconded from the army to work in Persia before the war. And it was on that basis that they took them. But Tamara certainly she was a very sick woman. I did go to see her in hospital. But she was a very sick, frail woman, but she didn't once mention Georgia to me. And yet she must have been aware of the significance of her name too. And after all, I think I'm right in saying that Queen Tamara to you is rather like Queen Elizabeth to us, a sort of a model of a good monarch.